Alex Krasodomski Jones is a researcher at the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at the British think tank Demos. His work has looked at extremism online and how extremist groups have adapted to the digital world. He has published work examining how Islamic State uses social media and digital technology and how it has done so particularly over the past year. Welcome back to ANN Satellite Television. Welcome to the English Hour. It's great to have you with us, and it's great to be here. Our guest today is Alex Krasodomski Jones from Demos, the think tank, and really it is something to have him with us. We've got Alex. Well, thank you for being our guest. Thanks very much for having me. We've got our three subjects. We're going to talk about, we're going to talk about ISIS, Daesh in the Middle East, but. And my pronunciation is terrible, and some people call it ISIL in America. It goes by, and there are those in the UK who insist on calling it the Islamic State, which is what they like very much to be called.
Well, the so-called Islamic State.
Yes. So where are we? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about social media and how they use social media, and we're going to talk about, about what we can do about it. We the people, what we can do about this situation. Thank you for being our guest.
Thank you for having me.
In the summer of 2014, ISIS swept into northern Iraq, taking Mosul. Since then, ISIS has drastically expanded in Iraq through the use of an extremely mobile force against a cumbersome and demoralized Iraq army. In Syria, ISIS took advantage of the disunity of rebel forces and the weakness of the government to annex large swathes of the nation. An offshoot of al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS is led by al-Baghdadi, who has proclaimed a worldwide caliphate and called on Muslims to observe their religious duty and serve the caliph. Baghdadi's call has caused Muslims across the globe to travel to the Middle East to aid ISIS or to attempt to establish similar organizations in other nations. ISIS has committed brutal, genocidal and repressive acts, including numerous war crimes and crimes against humanity, such as those against the Yazidi community in Iraq. ISIS has sought to utilize the Sunni versus Shia narrative to mobilize support, just as al-Qaeda in Iraq did in the early days of the anti-US insurgency. So, starting at the beginning, I mean, I'm smiling. It's such a serious and awful subject, but what can you do? Weep if you think about it. But Daesh, ISIS. I mean, maybe if I say what I think Daesh is, and you can just put your own. You know firsthand in the sense that through social media what your feeling about what Daesh ISIS is. For me, I guess it's something that's seized the emotional moment. It's a Sunni group that has somehow gripped this spirit of Sunni resurgence and in a fundamental way, but it's twisted it, as the way I see it. I mean, I see Daesh as twisted it because it's become so violent and so extreme. So it's seized onto this sense of Sunni disempowerment that has emerged from the post-conflict Iraq and the situation in Syria, and has seized on this and has now somehow, with this concept that now is Armageddon, these are the last days, has fired up international enthusiasm for this group. But I'm sorry to use this word, but it is perverted by this almost lust for violence. That's how I see ISIS, and it is that's its underlying flaw, and it's terrible. So this is a phenomena the world has to deal with. Is that an oversimplification, or is that, I mean, how do you perceive ISIS?
I think it's funny what you said about how I might have first-hand experience of a terror group being a 20-something sat in front of a computer screen in London, but I guess this is one of the facets of Islamic State, if you like, is this digital presence, and this is quite a new phenomenon in that they have a reach that extends beyond the TV screens, beyond the videos that are circulated, to a much more sort of intimate relationship with the online world, and it allows for it colours Islamic State in a very different way than we've seen before. And the other thing I think I would just add to your description would be that we in the West have a obsession with Islamic State as a sort of supremely violent organisation, and I think in many ways that's true. But that has been their aim, and it's their propaganda that has been targeted at the West, that has taught us that. And whether that is the perfectly scripted execution videos designed for public consumption with an English speaker, designed to go viral in the modern sense of the word, to be shared very broadly on the internet. When in fact, if we take perhaps a broader look at the types of content, the types of messages coming out from Islamic State, one of the key ideas is this of state building. So we are not just looking at a terror group here. We're looking at an organisation with claims or pretenses to building an Islamic state, hence the name.
And of course the nature of this phenomenon is that it grips people in the whole world. You get people following Islamic State from Britain, and quite a number. I mean, obviously because people have actually gone out in some numbers, and from other countries of the world. So from Australia, from France, from all over, and many of the not entirely, but many of the key ideologues that Islamic State are following are, or at least the foreign fighters within Islamic State are following, to be more precise, are Westerners. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's quite important to draw a distinction between Islamic State on the ground, if you like, Islamic State in Syria or Islamic State in Iraq, and then this sort of broader digital community that has grown up around it in a way that we haven't really seen before. You can sympathise with and you can take actions on behalf of or in the name of Islamic State without having ever stepped foot in Syria or in Iraq, or without ever having taken a plane to Turkey and tried to smuggle yourself across the border. Now that might be a violent attack because you've seen Islamic State content online and that has inspired you to carry out their instructions, because they have made explicit instructions to attack Western countries and other countries online.
Yes.
But also it might be more simple than that, and it might be the creation and the sharing and the spreading of propaganda, trying to encourage other people to pack their things and move and go to Syria or Iraq, or to carry out attacks, or more simply just to justify Islamic State and its existence and its actions and so on.
So, and just to be clear about this, I mean, when I say glibly, they believe it's the last days. Is that key to the Islamic State thinking, that this is Armageddon? Would you describe? I mean, obviously they're Puritan in their ethos, Puritan in the sense of back to basic Islam. If I understand Islamic State, they like. Well, I mean, maybe again I'm being oversimplistic, but the position of women, the treatment is not necessarily back to basic Islam, because Islam, as I understand it, doesn't treat women this way, but it's back to a basic cultural interpretation of Islam that is what we would call extreme Puritanism, very tough, very austere, and driven by this sense that it is now is the end of the world. Is that?
Well, certainly from our perspective, Islamic State is very puritanical. I mean, obviously they would say the opposite, and that you know
that we are very materialistic.
That we are very materialistic,
okay,
and
yes.
that actually, you know, the role of women actually frees them to sort of perform the roles that they were supposed to, and so on. Regarding this sort of end of days, sort of apocalyptic idea, I think it's a difficult one, because on the one hand you're absolutely right. This idea of apocalypse is quite high in their in the types of content that they circulate, but it's very difficult to build a state with an impending apocalypse, right? What's the point?
Yes.
So I think there is some tension there.
And they do believe. I mean, what is the prime thing that would distinguish them from, say, Wahhabi Islam? The fact that they believe in a caliphate now that is not a Saudi caliphate, but is a caliphate based around their leader. I mean, that is the key, or is that the key?
I don't know. I think that's when we come to the religious sides, that's not really my speciality. But I think there is, I mean, a clear rejection of Saudi Arabia is present throughout all of the content that they put out online. So yeah,
I mean, is the clear rejection of the Saudi state? I mean, what are their prime targets? Because there is a difference between Al Qaeda, I guess, and Islamic State. Al Qaeda talks about the far enemy and tends to focus more on that rather than the near enemy, whereas Islamic State is very much, as you say, about building a state now in the Middle East, as well as, I mean, Islamic State is a rejection of everybody else. Is that, I mean...
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that's reflected in their media output. So we see output designed for the far enemies, like us, in English, for example, staged in a way that they know will be picked up. And then there's content designed for the nearer enemies, be that Saudis, you know, the most obvious difference being the language. And then the even nearer enemies, where we see specific types of propaganda and messaging coming from within Iraq and Syria, aimed at the opposition fighters based in Iraq and Syria. This sort of hand-to-hand propaganda, which has been enabled by the web, and I'm happy to speak about.
Well, great. Well, maybe we should. I mean, we've talked briefly about what Islamic State is. It's not. I mean, maybe we'll come back to it, but maybe we need to move on to our second subject. So how they use social media, and we can come back to our first point, because it is so key to your own work, is understanding Islamic State and social media. So let's do that. Let's talk about that issue.
Sure.
ISIS uses a sophisticated social media strategy in order to promote its propaganda. It employs mainstream platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and WhatsApp to reach its targets. When ISIS first rose to prominence, its presence was promoted through the use of trending hashtags on Twitter. Twitter was also used to keep followers of ISIS updated on operations and advances made. Social media is also widely used to recruit ISIS members. Extremists can now easily reach Muslims in the Western world via the internet and encourage radicalization with their social media propaganda from the comfort of their own homes. Success is ensured by translating media productions into as many languages as possible. So now we come to the meat of our discussion as far as you're concerned, Alex, because this is really your field. I mean, the question of how ISIS, Daesh, Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, whatever we call this group, how they use social media, because and you understand this at a level I only barely comprehend. I mean, there are words here, social media platforms that I don't even understand, Telegram and so on. But maybe you can give us an overview of how it works. I mean, how ISIS uses social media.
Okay, so to be a little bit flippant, I think ISIS use social media in the same way that everybody else uses social media. I think it came as a great shock to the world that a terrorist group was on Twitter, was on Facebook, or was on WhatsApp. And this came as a big surprise. But in fact, if you think about the background of where these fighters are coming from, their ages, when they're young people, often from Western countries, that they've grown up with this stuff. For them, uploading a YouTube video, sending a tweet, even creating an app, these are all pretty trivial tasks. It just feels like a real step change when we compare it to the kinds of content and the content distribution methods used by terror groups in the past. No longer is a brown envelope with a video cassette in it arriving at the Al Jazeera studios, for example. Now, there is no gatekeeper, there is no editor, there is a mobile phone, it takes a video, that video might be edited, and then it's shared directly with an audience of millions. And in that sense, they use social media in exactly the same way we do. Now, where perhaps we might genuinely be surprised and genuinely be concerned is in the quality of their media output. So these are no amateurs when it comes to the media strategy. Everything is perfectly staged, as I say, designed for the audiences it's going to reach, and designed to cause as much shock and designed to be spread as far as it can be. So in terms of a media strategy, they are very sophisticated. In terms of a social media strategy, this is just the world we live in. We live in a world, in an age where young people communicate via the internet, and terror groups are no different.
Right, and it is, I mean, therefore, you're talking about, I mean, many people over 30 will not be fully, in up to speed on social media as it is today, because it is very much a young person's environment. I mean, it is, and wrinklies like me are completely lost. I mean, and yet it is such a power, such a force. The West is incompetent in terms of, I mean, the great governments of the world are incompetent in terms of social media, and this incipient state, this tiny group, relatively speaking, compared to the United States of America or the British government or whatever, has a powerful social media strategy. I mean, and it's based on, I mean, they're not putting out mountains of videos. What they're perhaps putting out maybe half a dozen a day. It's based on this people, then their supporters, their followers, picking this stuff up and resharing
it.
Yeah. I mean, can you explain a bit about that? Because it is not that everybody, I mean, you touched on it, it's not everybody is in Iraq and Syria doing this. I mean, it's the whole...
Yeah, a tiny percentage of well, to take it one step back, Islamic State consider the digital battle to be very, very significant. They've released a lot of content, including statements from high-ranking Islamic State fighters who stress the importance of this war for hearts and minds that's taking place online. They take this incredibly seriously, and we ought to take it seriously as a consequence. And what this has resulted in is a sort of three tiers of online user for the Islamic State. The first, as we know, would be the guys and the girls in Syria and Iraq who can produce first-hand footage, who are often under quite a strict control policy, for a sort of centralized control around the kinds of content that they can release. Then below them are what we would call the media mujahideen, the sort of maybe 9 to 10% of these online users still a minority who wake up in the morning, brush their teeth, have whatever they have for breakfast, and then spend 9 till 9, 9 till 10, 9 till 11 all day creating new content, posting that content, sharing content coming from Iraq and Syria, translating content for other audiences, maybe into Russian or into German. And this is their, every day this is their passion. Now imagine how that must measure up to our response. You know, can we really draw upon the same number of people with the same levels of passion? I'm not sure we can. Then below that, the vast majority, these sort of hangers-on, if you like, the sort of the interested, sympathetic parties who will take content, share content maybe, but it's not, you know, they have a day job, if you put it like that. So that sort of gives you an idea of how the different, and I guess the last thing to add is when you talk about this 90%, this vast majority of sort of sympathetic parties who may share this content, there is no central control here. There is no one media centre at the top that can dictate to the whole of Islamic State sympathizers online. So it's quite an organic phenomenon, and there is not all that much centralized control about the kinds of media, the kinds of propaganda that is being circulated.
And they do have, I mean, a quite impressive online magazine also, don't they? I mean, this is, I guess, just an element of their strategy. We shouldn't regard that as enormously important, but it is. I was surprised. I looked at it. I was surprised because it's published in English as well as in other languages. I was surprised at what a sophisticated publication it was. I mean, to put it bluntly, I was surprised by how interesting it was. And it interests me. It must interest. I mean, it gripped my attention. So, I'm aware of many organizations that put out magazines, and they're amateurish by comparison to Dabiq. I mean, really amateurish. I mean, you're talking about a sophisticated, interesting magazine that's way up there. I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement, and surprising to me. So this, if we destroy ISIS on the ground, let's say we retake Mosul. I mean, it's not the end of ISIS because this is not going away, is it? It's not something that's that easily. We can't just bomb it into obliteration.
No.
There has to be some other way of dealing with this.
Yeah, you have to challenge these ideas, and those ideas are, being circulated in places that are very difficult to challenge them. Online, the online world is designed for communities like these to grow and then to sort of split off, and then they can just talk to each other, free from external influence, free from attempts at counter-speech, or free from attempts at what we would call education, free from intervention. We see groups forming online, like-minded people, for example, Islamic State sympathizers, and the online environment provides them a space where they can communicate with one another in a bubble, outside, with no sense of perspective. And I think that's a real challenge when it comes to trying to tackle these viewpoints, because how do you get into those bubbles? It's almost impossible.
Now, there will be people listening to this. I mean, many people, many of our viewers in the Middle East listening to this, infuriated, saying, why can't you control it? Why can't you control the internet? Why can't you stop this? Why can't you? But, I mean, and there have been attempts to control it, and in the sense that you've had these... that organization Anonymous did some work on trying, and perhaps quite effectively, stopping the ISIS use of Twitter. But you can't. Ultimately, you can't. It's uncontrollable. Is that right? I mean,
yeah, I would say that technologically, attempts at censorship, and attempts at suspending accounts, attempts at removing content are pretty futile, if I'm honest. It's like a sort of the world's most difficult game of whack-a-mole, where you have thousands and thousands of moles popping up, but also millions and millions of pieces of content that you're not interested in. And it becomes a case of sort of a needle in a haystack, but on a scale that we can't possibly imagine. I mean, the example that we often hear, the criticism of social media companies, is that when whether it's a sort of Islamic State sympathizer or somebody who might go on to commit an act of terrorism, sends a message on their platform. So, for example, we heard in the inquest into the death of drummer Lee Rigby that the two men who conspired to kill him had sent a message on Facebook, on a social media platform, and there was outrage. There was front page news that Facebook hadn't done something about this. If they're using your system, surely you could have spotted that and flagged it up. But I think that shows a real lack of understanding of how difficult a task that is when we're talking about this scale of data. I think Facebook Messenger sees 30 billion messages sent a day.
Really? 30 billion a day?
I mean, to be able to comb that for
30 billion?
30 billion a day. And this, when that may include WhatsApp, which is another Facebook-owned thing. So we're talking about phenomenal scales of data. And I could put, and the other question is technologically, if you and I were to look through 100 messages and decide which one of those were terrorists and which ones weren't, we would disagree as humans. We would read them differently. So if we can't agree on it, how on earth can we teach a computer to agree on it in a way that we would understand to be in defense of national security? I mean, it's a monumental technological task, and I think our resources would be better focused on trying to tackle the ideologies, tackle the ideas, than getting on Facebook's back for not ratting out all the terrorists that are using its platform. I think that's an impossible task.
So given that situation, I mean, and there are little dynamics we need to touch on because we haven't. This content that ISIS is putting on social media, it's not all the content we would think of from a Western perspective as what we would anticipate a terrorist group putting out there. Some of it, for example, well, as I understand it, a considerable proportion, not merely some of it, but is jihadist poetry, for example. I mean, which we would never think of as the kind of thing that would be coming out in social media. I mean, at least in Arabic, that would be the case. So, I mean, there's a wide mix of stuff. And the stuff that's coming out from the Western ideologues that ISIS is following, or at least that ISIS fighters are following, by contrast, because, I mean, that's traffic the other way. The Western spiritual Islamic thinkers that ISIS fighters might choose to follow, and I think there were historically 4 in the UK, 1 in Australia, and 1 in the United States. That social media that they are following is very often almost anodyne. It's talking about how the best, most pure way you should behave in Ramadan or so forth. But they are consumers as well. I mean, of this stuff. Should we be? I mean, there are literally 4 or 5 or 6 people that ISIS foreign fighters subscribe to, and some of them, like Sarantino in Australia, have pretty much had their content taken off. But others of them are still up there. should we be taking these sources down? I mean,
it's a really difficult question. So we have, as you say, around 6% of Islamic State content is violent. 94% of it is something else, which would not necessarily fall foul of the standards that are set by both social media platforms, but also our understanding of what is a reasonable thing to say. Now, as you say, that might be religious discussions, ideological discussions, or it might be much more banal than that. A photo of what a particular jihadist has had for dinner. It might be a Q&A session where they ask what the weather's like in Raqqa and what they need to bring over. A question about how do you travel to Turkey. A question about what kind of guns are available to me. You know, or can I have a car when I arrive? You know, we've seen all of this, and this is a really difficult question. Is when we're trying to fight an ideology as poisonous as I think inspires the cruelest acts of the Islamic State, it's very difficult to know where to draw the line. What do we do about preachers that we broadly disagree with, but they cannot be said to have committed a crime? Now, in my view, I think banning radical preachers is not a good idea. I think it creates martyrs of them, which I think would be a bad idea, and that content and their views will, by the very nature of the internet, be spread anyway. You can guarantee that even though a preacher's YouTube channel has been turned off, all those videos still exist somewhere on the internet, and Islamic State fighters know how to find them. So this game of whack-a-mole is a waste of time. But I do think that we see perhaps too much prominence given to these kinds of views on mainstream media. And I think perhaps the BBC in the UK and American TV channels that love to bring on a controversial figure might reassess that policy and think, you know what, I think this guy's views, they're not helping anybody, and we should let them, you know, he can leave him and try to find a more moderate voice.
I think that's powerfully said. Yes, because unwittingly, in the seeking of sensation and excitement, a media channel can actually unintentionally promote a radical thinker.
Absolutely. Anjem Choudhury is a perfect example. The number of times he's been on the BBC, and I speak to my Muslim friends and colleagues, and they say, why on earth has this guy got any airtime at all? It's crazy and yet he continues to receive airtime. So yeah, I think an assessment of that policy and thinking about not only what would make the best story, but perhaps that would help in this sort of battle of ideologies, if you like, would be sensible.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hope some of our friends from the BBC will be watching and try and encourage them to be a bit more careful and thoughtful about what they are doing sometimes. But so all of this content, this amazing content. Just touch on. I don't want to bog our listeners down with too much technology, but I mean the main platforms being used by ISIS are the main platforms being used by young people, and they go beyond Facebook and Twitter, which are the two ones that we are familiar with. But they go to other things like what is it, Telegram? I mean, can you just identify the big social media platforms? You'd think I should know, but ISIS have a sort of technological zeitgeist where, as a new platform emerges, it's examined. How can this help? If it helps, we're in. If it doesn't, we're not interested. So Telegram appeared, and it looked good because Telegram as a platform had the opportunity to have a group discussion, lots of people following one account,
but left no room for counter-speech, no room for intervention. So it was like a sort of news feed being curated by Islamic State. And that was very popular for a while. After the Paris attacks, Telegram took all those channels down, presumably under some kind of governmental pressure. But they're all still, they've come back now. And I think the same can be said for all of these platforms. I think the one thing I would say, and without getting too technical, is I'm not sure. I think in as far as they are using the same platforms that most young people are using, they're also not using the kinds of platforms that they are often being accused of using, which are sort of very powerfully encrypted channels of communication. We are hearing an awful lot from ex-FBI directors, NSA directors, that powerful encryption is one of the key problems here. I'm not really sure. I think I'm going off topic. We can probably
No. Do okay. Talk about that. It's interesting to our readers because I mean people want to understand this, and I want to understand this. So you're saying that encryption, because people do say that encryption.
Right. So there is this argument that ISIS somehow communicate beyond the reach of our security services, and they do so by using the latest in encryption technology. Now, yes, there is evidence to suggest that ISIS have knowledge of the latest encrypted technologies, which since Snowden have become easier to use, easier to access, cheaper to access. But I think the problem is less one of access to the latest technology and its use. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that in terrorist attacks recently, there has been no encryption at all. In fact, in the wake of the Paris attacks, there's evidence that they were using SMS, unencrypted SMS, which has been kicking around for 30 years. The problem is that with so many people using so many different social media platforms and messaging apps, there's just so much noise, so many different channels of communication to try to monitor. It's not a question of cracking the code. It's a question of trying to keep tabs on so many different streams of information. And I think rather than laying the blame at the door of the companies trying to provide encryption, we have to look instead at how jihadists are capable of operating across a number of different channels, often non-digital. They may meet in person, they may write on a note, but basically with so many different channels of information flowing within such an ocean of noise, if you like, it's very difficult to keep up with these channels.
Interesting. Wow. It's absolutely fascinating. And so we've defined a problem. We've defined an immense problem because it's one that's not going to go away. I mean, let's say this again. It's one that's not going to go away. We can bomb Iraq and Syria flat, and the problem's still there. I mean, it goes beyond unless you. There's no way that militarily you can deal with this, and so we're back to a situation where the online world and our own. I mean, there are two issues here. There's a question as to whether there's something wrong with our own society and with our own and society everywhere, whereby people can feel they have to resort to extremism, and whether there's a need for a better ethos, a better ideology, where we need to build a counter ideology of love and understanding. Where because in a sense, this is ideology of ISIS is based on a rejection of the other. And then there's the issue of how we do that effectively, how we use social media as, and maybe that's where we want to come in now. I mean, where we want to move our discussion. We can talk about what we do to respond to ISIS, as we can move to that. ISIS uses the latest encryption technologies. However, cracking this pales in importance when compared to the sheer number of different channels that people can now communicate over, ones which in theory need now be monitored. Just as ISIS uses social media to promote their messages, we must use social media to counter those messages. However, when only 6% of the content shared on the internet by ISIS is violent, how can we really prevent the ISIS influence on social media? Can we build our own platforms on social media to control and counter this content? Even to promote credible voices from credible actors who can build a counter-narrative to that of ISIS would be worthwhile. By creating our own narrative, we can prevent Western media. By creating our own narrative, we can prevent Western media from giving ISIS the constant attention they crave. But yes, no, but it comes to social media, yes, the security service.
So the security services almost certainly have their feelers in, and they understand this. But in terms of providing a counter narrative or providing our own narrative, and by narrative I mean our own version of events, how the world is. Yes. It doesn't necessarily have to be how they see it. This is how we see it. And when it comes to dealing with terrorist groups and conspiracy theorists, which are what Islamic State are in many ways, governments are not credible voices. They are just part of the problem, and so obviously they would say that, or they are not credible voices. What we need is to promote credible voices coming from credible actors, and now that might mean sharing a piece of content produced by a non-governmental group, a more moderate group. Or just a moderate group, or it might be direct counter-speech, and it might be identifying people who are thinking about the types of questions that Islamic State raise, and we shouldn't be too flippant about that. We shouldn't take this too lightly. We shouldn't take it be too flippant about this. They raise questions that are on a lot of people's minds around. What is my place in the world, and what really should I be doing with my life, and taking them on. And one of the things about social media is it gives you that opportunity to contact people quite directly. The other thing I would say is a little bit more subtle, which is that with all the content that's coming out on social media channels, we can therefore use social media as a listening tool, not just as a way of shouting back into the void or shouting back at people or even taking them on directly, but simply to try to understand the kinds of problems and the kinds of people who Islamic State are trying to reach, because that's not an easy task. And if we can use the propaganda that's coming out of Syria, coming out of Iraq, being created in Saudi, being created in Indonesia, being created in the UK and America, if we can try to synthesize that, if we can read it and try to understand it, then it might give us a better chance of reaching the people who it's targeting and try to understand the messages that are being sent at them. Now that is a technological challenge. How do we synthesize all of this data? How do we synthesize all of these messages in a way that is sensible? But I think it's one worth pursuing. At CHASM, where I work, CHASM is the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, we are looking to try to build a tool, a piece of software that will try to sort of begin that process, to try to synthesize all of the messages that are coming from extremist groups like Islamic State, and to try to, on a daily basis, try to understand what's going on and try to inform the people who are trying to counter message what they need to be responding to.
And your initial feeling, it is this sense of, from what you just said, this sense of people wanting to feel, a sense of belonging. What am I doing with my life? Where am I going? How do I belong? What's my role? This is people want to be part of a family. That's the appeal of Islamic State, isn't it? People want to be part of something, a movement, a family, and people, young people particularly, take young people in Britain. Because there are plenty going from the East End of London or from Portsmouth or from wherever. They they feel this need to be belonging to something that's greater than themselves, and that it gives them a sense of enthusiasm. I mean, that's...
Yeah, I think a lot of ink has been spilled on trying to understand why different people go, and I think there are a number of reasons. I think that's definitely one of the really important ones. And I think it must exist in such stark contrast to how they feel in the UK, and perhaps they feel a sense of isolation in the United Kingdom. Perhaps they see reading the propaganda coming from Islamic State that is the solution. But there may be spiritual reasons, there may be religious reasons, there may be simply reasons of excitement. We've heard it described as a sort of gap year where you travel to Syria, you travel to Iraq, you get a gun, you drive around in a stolen car, and it's all very exciting. And you compare that to what is a much more mundane life here in the UK for many people, and it seems exciting and it seems new. So the reasons for it are, I think, very multifaceted, and obviously the reasons for certain people in Portsmouth might be different to the people in Birmingham. The reasons for women will be different to the reasons for men, and Islamic State caters to all of these. And by producing a wide variety of propaganda designed for all its different target groups, how on earth do you keep on top of all of this stuff? Well, that's a challenge.
But it's a challenge, really, that government, I mean, is so incompetent in a sense. I mean, government propaganda is, or it would seem, government attempts to issue propaganda are so clumsy, so inadequate, so ineffective. Is that fair? I think
the government, certainly in the UK, realise that the counter messaging comes from them. I mean, they're not stupid. They know that kind of counter messaging is not reaching the kinds of people who might be considering going to Iraq and Syria.
Yeah.
I would not say it's a waste of time, because I think it fills an important void. If journalists and broadcasters can turn to government channels for this information, well, they're not turning to Islamic State channels, and that is a win. That's a victory, because it allows us to tell our side of the events rather than just being spoon-fed what Islamic State want us to broadcast, which has been the case over the last year. If you remember when there were execution videos going out, it was all just screen-grabbed, spoon-fed to us by Islamic State, rather than having a source run by, say, our government that the journalists and broadcasters can turn to for the content that they want to report. So I think that is important. But you're absolutely right. If you compare the propaganda coming from Islamic State in terms of the quality of it, and you compare the sort of what we are, or certainly what our government is producing, there's no contest, right?
The Islamic State is way ahead of our government.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
However, there are non-governmental groups who are producing counter-narratives that have been seen to be effective, and maybe interventions that have been seen to be effective. So, I mean, for example, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue have looked to try to reach out to vulnerable people directly and put them in touch with former jihadists to give them a sort of sense of perspective on what actually it might be like. Now, these things cost a lot of money, and in turn, the phrase I turn to is always that we are both outnumbered and outgunned. Not only do they have more people producing their content, but their content is of a higher quality.
But we have, heaven knows how many people will be listening to this, but people can, presumably, if they, some of our listeners are in Syria, a substantial proportion of our listeners are in Syria, and that's a fact. And we certainly have listeners in Iraq. We certainly have listeners in Lebanon and North Africa. If listeners to this channel feel they want to do something
Mm.
They can't. They have the power. I mean, there is, in terms of social media, it's out there and it can be used by anybody, can't it?
Yeah.
And so they can, and they have the ability to put up their own messages on all of these platforms. Is there any point in them engaging with? There's no point in engaging with Islamic State, or is there, in terms of?
For me, no. I mean, you could, and the actions of Anonymous, for example, show this sort of, I don't know, quite this sort of attempt at a direct attack on Islamic State. But I'm not sure that. I think we can leave that to the people with the tech skills. But I think everybody has the opportunity to have to gain an audience for their views now, and I think very often social media and the internet caters very well. It's a great environment for that sort of personalized piece of personalized messaging, if you like, personalized piece of content. And if it's just if it's a powerfully written piece of if powerfully written rejection, for example, of Islamic State, or a powerful piece of counter messaging, whatever it is, social media has a knack of finding it an audience, and and it will share it in a way that it is very unlikely to share governmental stuff and stuff coming from big PR groups.
So, I mean, we get these terrible situations. Islamic State takes and kills people. For example, if people who have had relatives captured or killed by Islamic State wanted to put up their own cry of pain on the internet, for example, or if people who felt that they had a better ideology, they felt they had a better belief system that is love-based or whatever, I wanted to put that out there. I mean, can they, I mean, what should they be doing? Should they be using hashtags, and how can we, I mean, use Facebook, use Twitter, use Telegraph or Telegram or whatever it is, how do we do, I mean, is it just, we just say to our listeners, our younger listeners, or under 20s listeners, just do it, just write a poem once a day, or take a little video of yourself saying this is.
Who knows? I to be honest, they will know better than I will, and than we will. There is, with things like the internet and with social media, often the people who use it the most have the best understanding of its cultures, of its tropes, of its of what works and what doesn't. And I think if somebody would like to contribute to the debate, or would like to reject the things that they've seen in a public way, then they'll understand where the best way to do that. I think it's very difficult to be prescriptive about this kind of thing and say, oh, you know, go and make a short video or join this particular campaign. I think the things that work best are the things that are most natural, and it's quite difficult for me to say, oh yeah, you should do this or you shouldn't do that.
But those that feel strongly about Islamic State, those in Syria, those in Iraq that feel strongly about it, from whatever background, they should be out there on social media. It's no good just sitting back and complaining. Social media is the platform, really.
It's a platform, and it comes with its pros and its cons. You know, I think, you know, there are risks involved when you're dealing with the internet. It's there's no filter, there's no editor. You have no protection from how people might receive the things you have to say. There are trolls online. There are Islamic State supporters online who could respond to the things that you're saying in ways that you might find upsetting. But there's an audience there, and there's a willing and a receptive audience, and it's quite a risky platform. regardless of whether you choose to message on Twitter or on Facebook. But there is an audience there who I think would be very receptive to hearing more from people who have suffered under or as a consequence of Islamic State.
Interesting. So I mean, that is because I think this is so important, and we, all of us, people of conscience. I mean, because people are Islamic State is touching people with every language. I mean, it's out there in English, it's out there in Russian,
Mm-hmm.
it's out there in Arabic, obviously. So all of us have a role. It's not just the people of Iraq and Syria. I mean, people here in the UK, if they feel strongly, they should be putting out their own narrative.
And the thing with social media is, even if you're not a credible voice, you can amplify a voice that is. I think that's quite important here. I mean, I'm not sure that I am a credible voice in reaching out to people who are vulnerable or whom I feel that they want to, or who are being asked questions, or who are questioning themselves, and so on. However, I might be able to amplify the voices of people who are credible actors. Maybe they are former extremists or former jihadists, or maybe they are simply people who are in the same position, who are themselves vulnerable and have spoken out about that feeling. I can try to spread that. I can try and help those messages spread. So it's not. You don't necessarily have to create your own content to be able to share and spread content that you agree with.
So we need to retweet or put up on our Facebook pages the stuff that we feel passionate about, that sends out that kind of message.
Yeah, and even if that doesn't do anything, it maybe encourage somebody else to join, because they'll see one video, actually that's done quite well, maybe I should make one as well, rather than all of these pieces falling on deaf ears, and instead we share an execution video, or we share the latest press release from the Al Hayat Media Centre. I think
wow. So we can make it. Oh, I hope it sounds to me like we can make a difference in this battle. And
I guess there's one other thing I think is worth saying on this. We can post stuff on social media. We can not read things on social media, whatever. But I think the key thing we have to do is to try to teach young people that everything they see online is not necessarily as it seems. Now that could apply to your Facebook feed. Does your Facebook feed really accurately reflect the lives of your friends? You could think about the conspiracy theorists who present accounts of how 9/11 was an inside job and how Bush did it, or how there is a conspiracy that runs the world, a Freemason conspiracy. And in the same way, we need people, when they see a piece of propaganda, to approach it with some skepticism. These are very well constructed pieces of propaganda. They are very compelling, but the danger I think we have is as a generation, the generation after me and my generation, I think we've lost that skeptic's eye on content. And when we see something online, if it looks real or it looks compelling, we've lost the ability to say, you know what, I'm not sure that's exactly how. I'm not sure that's an accurate reflection of real life. I think one of the key things, if not the key thing, to take away from what we can do about this is to teach young people that not everything they see online is accurate, and that they should approach it with a bit more savviness, a bit more awareness, a bit more skepticism. This sort of digital fluency, digital citizenship, whatever you want to call it, is fundamental, and I think it's something that we've lost sight of, and we need to bring back into either the curriculum, but certainly into just how people use the internet.
So we need to be less gullible to use. I mean,
right?
Yeah. Wow. Well, Alex, thank you very much. That's really awesome, actually. I'm sure that's very helpful to our listeners, very helpful to me, and and I'm sure it'll stir up a lot of reaction and content. Really, thank you for being our guest on ANN.
No, thanks very much for having me.
Phenomenal. Bless you. My goodness, what we've learned. It is phenomenal, really, listening to this man and listening to his understanding of a world in which I don't move as much as I should do. Social media is largely a mystery to me. But to many of our listeners, it's what you live and breathe. And what are we going to do? What should we do? How can we interact in terms of social media? I think you can do a lot. I think that you, our listeners, can be effective. You can put out your own message. You can certainly send around the message of those that you admire and that you feel are putting out the right kind of ideology, the right kind of thinking for a safer and better and more caring and loving world, which is what we all have to believe in. So you can do that. I think actually, it seems pretentious to invite you to write into ANN, but do, if you have thoughts. Our email address is on the screen. Do use it, and do feel free to write to us with your own comments, and send us your videos, your social media output, whatever, your pictures that you feel are important in terms of putting out the message that you believe is right and honest and fair. And we all have a duty not to be gullible. I mean, heaven's sake, we must think twice when we hear conspiracy theories that are unreal, and we must not be susceptible to propaganda from anybody that is incredibly false. And there's too much false propaganda. False propaganda from everybody out there. There's false propaganda from people like Daesh, ISIS, but there's also false propaganda from many intelligence agencies. We must not be gullible as people. And journalists are often gullible. You'll find unsourced material in your newspapers and on your broadcasts where people say, I know something, I have heard something. We must all learn in this modern world to question the sources of information we're getting. I do think this has been an important broadcast. I think it's one that matters, and I think it may give us some clues as to how we can act, because we do need to act to counter the propaganda of Islamic State. Thank you very much for being with us today on ANN Television.